A woman will look at a job description and they will not apply unless they have close to 95% of the qualifications listed. Men would apply even if they just have 60% of the qualifications. And so there is this hesitation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Educative Sessions, a podcast series within the developer world about their coding experience. This is brought to you by Educative, which makes it easy for authors to provide interactive and adaptive courses for software developers. My name is Lee Ngo, and I am the host of Educative Sessions. Today, my guest is Elaine Montilla, who is interested in talking about the future of technology. But in her view, the future of technology is humans. Elaine, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lee.
Absolutely. So, you have this organization, 5xminority, yes, that is involved in very much this interest of being human-centered with technology. So let's go very much to the beginning of what your earliest experiences were like in technology and how they began to inform the trajectory of your work now.
Yeah, I can tell you early on when I came to the US, mind you, I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. And so when I came to the US, I was already 17 going into college. And my first job was working in the computer lab. And I remember those days and how good I felt helping people. And that's how my love for tech started. It was actually just helping students print or helping someone with a Word document. And that's when I decided, you know what, I think desktop support is good for me because I will be helping people and I love seeing their faces whenever I fix a problem. So that's my first memory of loving computers. I also have an older brother who loves computers, and he would open computers in a table and change memory and change hard drives, and I would watch him. And just, I'm always a curious person, so I was curious about what he was doing. And I think combining those two helped me get into tech early on.
It's great that you had a lot of a warm, inclusive experience, for people to actually show you the ropes. I think for a lot of people, that's often what it takes, right? Like a comfort and early familiarity in order to do some earlier explorations. But that's not always the case with a lot of people, right? It's this thing now, of course, with our own organization. I assume with the same as yours, is that we want to welcome people in and get them to be empowered by these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say the history of tech is actually one of mostly exclusion and mostly
Yeah.
one of a certain kind of prototype or person uh, is presumed to be able to handle it and therefore should be welcomed into it. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the work you've done in this
Mm-hmm.
space and the kinds of stories you've gathered about other people who have maybe felt this way too.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'll share more stories about myself. I can tell you that early on when I started going to college and studying computers, I remember my first day walking into a C++ course on programming
Mhm.
and looking around and telling myself, wow, I don't know if I can do this. I'm one of three girls in the classroom. And I learned that I could do it, but that was one of my earliest experiences where I felt that I would be alone or that I would be the only girl because I felt that way in the classroom. Now, transition a few years later, when I got my first job in tech, I can tell you that because English is not my first language, and I was learning English at 17 when I first moved to the US, it took me a while to be proficient in the language. And so I remember being in meetings where I wanted to say something, but I couldn't because I was translating in my head from Spanish to English and I didn't have enough time to say what I wanted to say. And something that I noticed is that people, especially in tech, are very impatient. If you don't say something really fast, they just move on and go to the next topic. Something else that I experienced early on was getting interrupted often, mostly by men.
Mhm.
And so I had to learn how to deal with that. I had to learn how to use my voice. I had to learn that my voice matter. I had to learn how to speak up, which is very difficult for someone like me coming from a culture where we are usually told, be quiet, sit down, don't get too much attention on yourself. And so I grew up thinking that, and it took me years to unlearn all of the things that my parents would tell me growing up in the Dominican Republic, which is not their fault. probably what they were taught also. So I had to learn how to deal with all of that. And, the last thing I want to share is that you probably already know this. In technology, everything changes so fast that I realized that if I didn't consider myself a student, it would be a problem for me, because by the time I finished learning something, 20 more things came up. So I always made an effort, especially because I'm Latina and because I'm female. I always made an effort of studying even more than anyone else and trying to stay up to date with certifications and degrees, because I knew that if I wanted to succeed, my resume needed to show that and not just someone looking at me. So I worked pretty hard at keeping up and staying up. And even today, any place I go to, I always consider myself a student, because I know there is always something that I could learn from others.
That's wonderful to hear, and it's wonderful how you've self-empowered in a lot of ways in order to really get what you want. I want to make, it's almost like a confession and even an apology in a general sense, not specifically to you, but I personally am terrible when it comes to, say, interrupting. And I've noticed over time how often I do it and whom I do it with, and it's and I guess my point is, first, I think it's a terrible habit, and I try to step back. But I have noticed that a lot of the work shouldn't necessarily be on your shoulders and the shoulders of people who are being excluded and spoken over and ignored when it comes to these things. That the work actually should come from those who, like myself, for whatever reason, acculturated into thinking to speak. But and there are oftentimes, even amongst others, I feel constantly interrupted, and it's an exhausting exercise to have to force your conversation, right? Like, and so I want to say I empathize, but also apologize, in a general sense. Like, I want to do better, and I'm trying my best, and I still fail.
And you know what, Lee? I wanna thank you for, first of all, being vulnerable enough to acknowledge something like that. I think that what happens sometimes is that we as humans are so focused on the things we want to say that we don't have the patience, or we are not curious enough to hear what the other person has to say, because we just want to talk about ourselves and we want to take over. So it's a habit that is not easy to change, but you took the first step, acknowledging that there is something you want to work on and you want to be better at. And I mentor a lot of young girls now, and one of the first things that I do is teach them how to deal with interruptions in the workplace, because I know how often it is going to happen.
Right. I'll say it's been a long journey, and I am still learning. But I appreciate at least the acknowledgement that it's not just the work of some people; it's the work of everyone, right? I would love now that we've kind of opened up the door about the fact that you were training young people to be more empowered. What are some more common obstacles or just general ways in which people are, I guess let's call it, what's the word I'm looking for? It was like minoritized or something like that, and I don't want to say too far as saying oppressed, but like much more like relegated. I'll use that term. Ways in which, this community is still relegating people of color, women, etc. And I know you're very much interested in either a broad sweeping social change, but we can talk either at a macro level, or you can talk about in the kind of training that you do. I'd love to know a little bit more about things that, I'd like to think I'm as educated as I can be about these things, but I can always use more.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are two parts to this, I would say. There are the external factors, which is what companies are doing and some things that they can work on. And there are the internal factors. And so when I mentor a lot of young girls, I like to focus on the things that we can control, right? So what you do with the company, what the CEO decides to do tomorrow, we don't control any of that. So I try to focus on the things that we could control while educating them on the external factors. So I'll start with internal. One of them is impostor syndrome, which from research, it shows that it affects women more than men. But I went through it myself early on in my career, where I just didn't think I was as smart as other people were saying I was. And so I try to share, some ways and how to deal with imposter syndrome, how to deal with being interrupted in meetings, um, how to promote yourself, which is a huge deal. A lot of women don't promote themselves or are not comfortable promoting themselves. And so I wrote an article about that recently. But let me talk about external factors because I think those are more important.
Yes.
The first one is unconscious bias. And we all have it. You have it. I have it. I think that it takes a lot of mindfulness to be present and realize that you're saying something or repeating something that someone told you years ago and you never question. So there is unconscious bias in many processes during the day. And so one of my recommendations is to have some training that you could do every year because we tend to forget. You go to the training and then 6 months later, you forget that you're interrupting, mostly women in a meeting. The second issue that I've seen over the years is that we have very outdated hiring practices. I don't know if you've looked at job descriptions recently. Sometimes they're 3 pages long, and sometimes I would read them, and I don't know how we can find someone that has all of the qualifications that are listed there. And one of the reasons it affects women the most is because a woman will look at a job description and they will not apply unless they have close to 95% of the qualifications listed. Men would apply even if they just have 60% of the qualifications. And so there is this hesitation where we feel that we have to know it all. I'm not going to apply if I don't know it all. And so I wish that companies would not create a wish list as a job description and understand that there is so much we can learn in the workplace, right? Another issue that is huge for me is the fact that we don't have blind auditions. And so what I mean by that is if a resume comes in, let's remove the names. There is so much bias in the name of someone when you're reading a resume. And listen, so most of the time, you don't even know you're doing it. You look at 2 resumes that look exactly the same, and John Smith, for some reason, gets a higher rating than Elaine Montilla because of how the name sounds. So we need to be mindful of that. And I think more recently, the lack of support and mentorship that women receive are making women leave the workplace, especially flexibility that I think now, because of the pandemic, companies are more willing to accept because we have demonstrated that we could work from home. Everything gets done, sometimes even better. And so I think that we're keeping women out, especially moms and caregivers, because we don't give them the flexibility that they need.
Wow. That's a lot.
That's a lot. I know.
Although,
I have more, but I said, let me stop here.
It sounds like your work's cut out for you already. And I do want to ask on this note that so it's wonderful that you've even in a quantified way identified so much of these biases that are happening and so much of the ways that are so beyond the control of those who are minoritized and all that, and yet at the same time, a lot of that is hopefully within their control. Like you said, with imposter syndrome, usually when in our world, we experience a lot of that in the question of whether one can code or not. But even the question of whether one is worthy of a job or not is fascinating to me because I've been on both ends, and I've learned over time as I've started to see from the other perspective, from the hiring perspective, how there is no real such thing as a perfect candidate out there. There are people who come close, but then that's just the first move. It does take energy, but not as much energy as one you'd think to actually just try to see what happens and go. So I'd love to talk about to come closer to our theme of talking about the human importance. Right now, we've talked a lot about access, and we've talked a lot about being able to participate in the community. I'd like to talk about how a lot of these things are happening, and we were starting to identify them. But but like the results in terms of implementing better practices in hiring, better practices in, let's say, gender equity when it comes to the workspace. This is an anecdote I can't believe I'm sharing, and I'll try to be as vague as I can. But I'm often, based on the way I look, presumed to have a certain kind of skill set.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird for me to admit on a podcast that I run, I'm not as technical as people think I am, let's just
Mm-hmm.
say. I have degrees in sociology and anthropology, and most of my degrees are in most of my work has been everything from media to marketing to nonprofits, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I emphasize that quite strongly in my resumes and in my daily conversations. But yet, why do people presume, oh, no, he's got the code thing down too? I'm like, what's going on there, right? So I guess, I'm going to ask bluntly, like, what are ways in which like workplaces can be very effective in noticing these issues and closing these gaps a bit more?
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that because, like I said earlier, we all do it. I have, I like watching my thoughts. I like being an observer, and I've had moments myself where I would say something and then tell myself, "Oh, why did you say that? That makes no sense." But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work for you to not see someone and put a label on them, for example. Some of the things that from my experience have helped. The one of the biggest one is making sure that we create psychological safety for our employees. I don't know if you heard that term before, but it's this notion that you could be yourself in front of me and that you're not going to be scared of saying something wrong because I'm going to yell at you and get you out of the room. And so every time I have a meeting with an employee or with a direct report or with a team, the first few minutes of the meeting, I make sure that there is a conversation that maybe it's not related to work, but let's make sure people feel comfortable being themselves. I can tell you that it was exhausting for me when I went into the workplace and I needed to fake being another person. I was one version of Elaine at home. And then when I went into the workplace, I was another version because I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. And I was worried about sharing that in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing the difference that it made once I did, because I can be myself 100%. And I think we need to create these spaces where people can be themselves 100%, because creativity goes up and collaboration goes up and a whole bunch of other things that we probably don't take advantage of because they're hiding or because they're really thinking it before they give you the answer, because they want to give you the answer that you want instead of the answer they want to give you. Something else that I wanted to share was that because of the pandemic, especially, I think the importance of compassionate leadership has come up even more. Um, I think that we need to empower our managers and leaders to understand that we need to see people as humans first instead of all the other labels that we put on them. People look at me and the first thing they see is, okay, Latina, female, lesbian, techie, uh, there's so founder, CIO. I mean, there's so many titles, and each one means something different to the person who's talking to me. I see my staff as humans first, and then from there, okay, you have a problem with this project. Let's talk about it. What's happening? I think that a lot of companies sometimes would create ERG groups, which are working, employee resource groups, but the issue that I see is that sometimes they're not empowered to make decisions or they're not supported financially. And so you see these ERG group members using their own time and money to make things work, right? And so I am hoping that companies listening to this could maybe move back a little bit and try to see, what am I doing today? What's working? What's not working? I also noticed that, for the past year, I don't know if you noticed, DEI has come to the top, and, diversity officers are thrown left and right, but sometimes they're not supported. Sometimes they don't report to the CIO, for example. And so if you have a diversity officer reporting to HR, there is conflict of interest there. If they're not financially supported, just like ERG groups, there is a conflict there because they're not able to do the things that they want to do. And I think flexibility is the biggest one. We're going to lose a lot of people, especially in IT, because we're not allowing them to be flexible. I think that people sometimes are thinking that we're going to go back to the way things were before, and that is just not sustainable. People are adult, responsible human beings who can do what they need to do. And if we don't take that seriously, we're going to end up with so many vacancies. I think we're seeing that now with the great resignation, or shifting, because some people are not leaving, they're just shifting jobs and going into companies that give them the flexibility that they need.
Right. Two large things to unpack in what you just said there. One is, which I think are worthy of just reiterating. One is that and it almost, but in a way, I think they'll point to one common theme, which is this is actually a pretty monumental time in the workplace. For one, and the ways that things were being done before just need to change. And things related to diversity and inclusion, that's been an ongoing discussion for some time now, and I'd say gradually that's been improving, everything from how to properly discuss things like pronouns, or how to be much more culturally sensitive to things in the office. No place is perfect, but there's, I would say, in my youth compared to now, and I'm still in these workplaces, but the actual mindfulness and at least consideration of, we actually maybe shouldn't be doing these things, versus, yeah, we can do these things all the time. What are you going to do? Report us? Like, that was a mentality I grew up with in my early days in working, is that like it was much more of a free for all. And then the other thing you mentioned about, I think it all ties in with the Great Resignation and this debate over, can work from home be sustainable versus a hybrid model versus or is in-person office work the optimal way? And I think with the way that technology is now, I personally, this is me going on a rant, and I might get in trouble for this, but whatever. It's totally possible. Like, it's not just totally possible, but all like the prestigious companies are already saying, now we're just going to do this. We're not going to even try to fight this anymore, because I think we all want to work in this way. And, we'll see what it does to productivity. But I think in a way, there's a bigger way to look at it rather than the short-term gains of productivity. I think employee retention, community building, respecting the fact that online communities and workspaces and collaborations and productivity has been going on for decades. So why do we still hang on to the notion of just having to be within proximity with each other?
Yeah. And that's why I mentioned flexibility over and over and over again, because as an employee, I can tell you that I know when I need to go to the office. I know when I need to meet with people in person. And there are days when I have 5 meetings back to back, and I know I need to stay home. Why would I go to the office if I know I'm going to be in front of a computer for 5 hours or more, moving from one meeting to the next? I think that sometimes we want to force people to do what we want them to do, instead of having a conversation with the human being in front of you and saying, what works for you? Let's see what works for us. And maybe it's a mix of both. And so hybrid is acceptable. You may have a conversation with someone who would say, you know what, I don't want to be home. I have technicians who tell me, Elaine, I don't want to be home. I want to come to the office. And so why not be flexible to see what works for everyone, instead of this one thing works for everyone? That's just no longer happening. I think we have proven already that we could work from home. It's the same as some of the issues that women deal with in the workplace. Some of the rules have been in place for so many years that we just keep doing the things we're doing because we've done it for so many years, instead of maybe this is not working. Maybe we need an additional bathroom for a new community of humans that are in this building. Why don't we think about that?
Or the community has always existed, but in order for them to be empowered and to feel a sense of ownership in the space, I'm preaching to the congregation, but I'm 100% aligned with, and I even thought while you were talking about hybrids, and like the very notion of hybrid is flexibility. It's accommodating for the fact that things don't fit into categories, or there's no one single right way to do things. I don't know if you're a fan of the show, like The Office, for example, and like that's what life used to be like before people went remote. You know, we'd all have to be in the office and have to, for better or worse, mostly for worse, deal with each other. And like, and I mean, I'm just imagining, you know, like everything you're saying, like my own work style is similar to that. There is freedom in that. There is autonomy in that.
Hmm.
And I mean, you know, I hope in most cases, like it actually becomes even much more of a liability to be in the office when I'm like, oh wait, but like all my equipment's here, all my ability to be quiet and focus is here. But even if I go to the office, no one wants to talk to me because they're all working too. So what are we doing here? You know, like
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to combine that with accountability.
yeah,
If you empower your managers on how to manage remote employees and they know what to do, then I don't see why it wouldn't work. But we also need to take care of our managers. I mean, managers are now expected to do so much more than before. And there is a big issue related to mental health that we need to deal with on top of everything else that I just mentioned. And managers are not equipped to deal with that. I probably was a bit more because I'm a very spiritual person, but
mm.
even the role of the CIO in the past years has changed dramatically. The conversations that we're having are very different now.
But don't you think I'm just gonna we're on so many soapboxes, but don't you think that managers shouldn't they be at least somewhat empathetic towards issues of mental health on their staff? Don't you think they should be on things like diversity and inclusion and even like comfort zones and productivities, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I'm gonna be. Here's another hot take. I think managers have had it too easy. I think
You know
the
what?
culture's
You said the word should.
optimism. Right. Oh, I get called out for saying should all the time, but I firmly believe this. I think yes, it's very difficult to be a manager, but then so much of I'd say a lot of advancements within the space is about how to optimize things so that managers can manage like with a lot
Yeah.
more ease. And I'm just like slow your roll a little bit. Maybe
Yeah.
we're losing something in the process, right?
Well, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Managers should know these things. The problem is that they don't. And so what are
Mm.
we doing? The second problem that I have seen happening now is that so many people are resigning or retiring that we're putting people into management positions without them being ready or without them
Mm.
being supported because we're so short staffed. I see that happening more and more. And so, as a person, of course, I should know these things, but maybe I was raised not knowing these things. So, what can I, as a company, do to support you? Maybe it's a class on emotional intelligence. Maybe it's a class on project management. Maybe it's a
Yeah.
class on, how to have productive or difficult conversations. We need to help them. They need help. There's too much on their plate right now. They cannot do it all. And a lot of them are being pushed into positions when they're not even ready just because we don't have anyone else or we don't have enough money to hire another person. That's happening a lot.
Right. Right. And that's, you know, I maybe I'm being too hard. But I do firmly believe that I would want a manager who has at least that kind of training,
Of
who
course.
knows how to at least like when I'm expressing things that are going to be on perhaps a psychological level, because you know, it's not a question of skills. The manager doesn't need to do exactly what I'm doing, but they need to help me do it. You know, and most times our biggest enemies are in our own heads, right? Um, so that would and just to feel comfortable and supportive would be ideal. Um, Elaine, I have one more question for you. It's a futurist question, but you know we are in a tech, so what are you going to do? What would you like to see happen? Let's say in the next 10 years, with
Mm,
all the kind of work that you're doing and all the advocacy that you're doing, not just from young people but across the board. Um,
yeah.
it's funny, I even have the word "should" in my question, but I think you'll know to go from here. I'm like now I'm scared to even like come back to that point.
No,
But yeah,
I love this question. It's
okay,
like my biggest wish. I love this.
yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I found the 5X minority. I really wish that companies would take those who don't, ERG groups more seriously, the role of the diversity and inclusion officer more seriously. Um, there is a lot of research out there that shows that women leave tech um, because they don't get the support that they need. And so you see, what I see now is that we're using a lot of marketing, right? to have beautiful words on our website about our commitment to diversity, but we are not transparent about salaries, right? So in 10 years, I hope that we are comfortable enough that we can share that with everyone. I hope that we don't use check marks to say we are okay because we hire a Latina, because we hire an Asian person or a Black person. I want us to know that when the person is hired is when the work actually begins. Let me make sure that I pair them with a more senior person. Let me make sure that I support them. Let me make sure that they have the additional training they need, maybe because they're a manager who never knew how to have difficult conversations. I wish that we can support them in that. And I think that it's a difficult time. We need to learn how to be more compassionate towards other people at every level, at every level. So I want to put the word human in front of any label that you want to give someone. And I'm hoping that I see that in the future.
I mean, it should be self-evident, right? Like, I mean, like, do you need to know that I'm a human community manager, or do I need to know that you're a human entrepreneur? And I'm not trying to be mocking, but it's sort of like, but I know what your point is that we're losing that perspective that we're working not just with variables of productivity. These are people, and they're people who, in order to make them as successful as possible, you can't just give them a directive and just let it be. That's an ineffective
Yeah,
system, right?
so here's what's happening. I know where you're coming from, and everything that you're saying is what I wish I would see. This is how things should be.
Yeah.
That's not how they are. And so for a leader to say, I am not allowing conversations about police brutality because that's outside of the workplace, that is no longer the answer. We cannot do that anymore. I had a meeting with all my managers last week or 2 weeks ago, and I took a moment to acknowledge what's happening with the Asian community here in New York City. And so because I'm a human being and I see them as human first, I can see how this affects them in the workplace. They may need a few hours to go outside and walk. And so I think, so I hope this moves my point forward and you can understand 100%. We are afraid of having difficult conversations in the workplace, and we forget about the humanity of the people working with us. Even during the George Floyd incident, I sent an email to all the staff to let them know I support them. We can no longer have a separation where I'd say, you know what, this is project management and I don't want to hear about anything else. No, tell me, how do you feel today? Is this affecting you? Is there anything I can do to help you? Okay, do you need a few hours off? I totally understand that. Do we need to move the deadline by a day because you're going through something at home? We need to have those conversations, and we're not having them. We are only focusing on, I gave you a deadline and you did not do it. Therefore, you must be blank. Fill it with whatever word you want. Wow. We can't do that. We can't do that. And what's happening is that employees know that, and it's no longer, I work for you and that's it. No, I work for you, but you work for me too. We're working together. So I'm going to take care of you, but you need to take care of me too. And that's what I want to see moving forward.
I agree. I don't want to even sound remotely like I'm not. I mean, and I can think of so many, like the incidents that you've mentioned and more, where that they impact the community. And I think maybe, just like instead of looking at people as like instruments of productivity as humans, looking at, a workplace and changing that into a community might change a lot of the mindsets around how managers think too, right? And to be an authority versus a leader is also another. I mean, these are semantics, one could say, but to me, there's specific interpretations to each of those words. And a true leader to me is not the same thing as an authority. It's someone who's acting exactly the way that you're describing, as someone who says, if you need a moment to step back, you let me know when you're ready. That's the kind of leadership I want in my life. And,
me too.
and I hope that's the kind of leaders that you and I are too. So, Elaine, this has been amazing. I wish we had more time, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk very openly about the work that you're doing now. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I founded 5X Minority a few years ago, and one of the reasons I did is because I knew that now that I'm in a leadership position, I have a voice and I have a platform, and I want to reach out to all the young girls and men also and minorities who probably feel invisible and feel that their voices are not heard. And so we work really hard on elevating the voices of women and minorities in tech. And so I would welcome everyone to visit 5xminority.com. You can find us at 5x Minority on all the major social media platforms. And if you have free time, watch my TEDx talk. It's the value of mentoring women and minorities in tech. And I hope you gain some new information from it, and reach out to me on LinkedIn if you choose to also. And thank you for having me. This was an amazing conversation. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being on the show as well, Elaine. Elaine Montilla, really happy to have you here. And I also want to thank everyone else for either watching this on YouTube or listening to this podcast on our various podcasting platforms. You can check out more of our content there as well. Please also, if you want to learn a little bit more about what we do at Educative, check us out at educative.io. So for all of us here at Educative, thank you so much and happy learning. Bye-bye now. Hi there. Hope you enjoyed this educative session. Be sure to check out more on YouTube or on any podcasting app. And be sure to like this episode and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Happy learning.